listening to the Hour of History podcast with your hosts Stephen Bauman and Matthias Fueling and producer James Albel. The Hour of History podcast aims to understand how we know what we know and why the past matters. Without further delay, your Hour of History begins right now.
Hello, welcome to Hour of History. I'm Stephen Bauman, I'm your host, and I have a very special guest. Along with me today is Keith Riley. He's at Temple University working on his PhD, and welcome, Keith.
Thanks for having me, Stephen. Really excited to be here.
So, what do you study? What is it you're interested in?
So I'm like kind of like broadly interested in leftist politics in the United States, kind of, you know, post 68 and onward, and sort of my dissertation project that is as it exists now is kind of focusing on activists in the United States who in a variety of ways support the Sandinista government in Nicaragua that emerges in 1979 and is officially voted out of power in 1990. So kind of the various ways that American leftists support the Sandinista government. There's thousands of people that go down to Nicaragua to help harvest coffee and cotton. People build schools down there. You know, just kind of Nicaragua becomes in the 1970s and 80s sort of a place that is sort of romanticized by the left, much like Cuba was at the beginning of the 60s sort of.
Yeah. Cool. So on Hour of History, like a lot of times we're talking about these issues and we tend to focus it on nations just because like that's an easy unit of looking at it, but it's kind of cool that already you're looking at it through through leftist politics, so it's already gone beyond a nation, right?
Yeah.
It's a connection that, you know, it goes beyond one nation, but most of the time you're focusing on Sandinistas and the 70s, right? So tell us, what is a Sandinista? Where is Nicaragua? Give me the basics.
Okay, sure. Nicaragua is a country in Central America, right? Bordered by Costa Rica to the south, and also Honduras and El Salvador, right? There's a little bit of water, that goes between El Salvador and Nicaragua, but it's right there, essentially, right? So Central America, right, in the late 70s and especially in the 1980s, right, is sort of the last kind of battleground of the Cold War, right? Mm-hmm. There's kind of fighting between Marxist guerrillas and sort of the U.S.-backed dictatorships that exist in places like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, right? That happened during the late 1970s and 1980s. The Sandinistas are essentially, right, like a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group, right, that emerge in 1961, form in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, in opposition to the Somoza dictatorship, the kind of three-generation government of Somoza, like fathers and brothers, right, that rule over Nicaragua with an iron fist from 1934 roughly to 1979. Listeners
who have heard like Matthias and I talk about Iran, we've talked about the Pavlovis and stuff like that. That sounds distinctly American to be supporting a dictatorship. Like, what were the Somozas? Why were they important? And, you know, why is the U.S. getting involved? How far back do we actually have to go?
Oh, wow. Yeah, we have to go really far back.
But we don't have to.
We don't have to. But like the kind of the U.S. intervention in Nicaragua can go back almost like to the Civil War era, in which like a kind of U.S. sort of I don't know what the right word is, but like a pro-slavery sort of colonist named William Walker goes to Nicaragua, tries to overthrow the government there in order to establish Nicaragua as a slave, like a slave state for the United States, a slave colony.
Is that like part of the, like, I think it's the Golden Circle conspiracy. Have you heard of that?
No, what's that?
Oh, I don't know. I was reading about this, like, it deals with this, like, these guys who were pro-slavery, who wanted to establish, like, this circle around the Gulf of Mexico, including Cuba and Central America,
right,
with the American South, and they could have, like, this Knights of the Gold. It was like,
wow.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's totally part of it. Like, that the historian Walter Johnson like writes about that in his book, River of Dark Dreams. Is a cool book.
Yeah.
But sort of, so obviously, right, the U.S. interventionism goes way back.
Yeah.
But in terms of like the Sandinistas, so the Somoza government, right, is important to the United States because it's a pro-U.S. government in Latin America at the time in which sort of Cuba is emerging as a power, right? We use Nicaragua as a base in order to, right, like, essentially, right, the base in which sort of pro-U.S. troops are based out of in order to overthrow the Arbenz government, which is another sort of pseudo-social, almost socialist, right, government in Guatemala, right? So in that sense, right, Somoza is an important ally in Central America, right, at a time in which Guatemala is pursuing land reform policies, right, giving more land to the peasants, etc. So I guess a pro-U.S. place in a place that is, in a sense, right, trying to establish its distance from the U.S., its independence from the U.S.
Okay, and so, and what is the U.S. getting out of this beside having, like, stability? What else? We're interested in food. What else? What does Nicaragua have that...
Okay, like exports and stuff. Sure. So, I mean, Nicaragua... is, one of the, Central America in general is probably the main supplier of coffee to the United States, right?
Oh, delicious.
During this time. Yeah. So, essentially, right, kind of the, brutal force of the people that own the land, people that own the coffee plantations in Nicaragua, right, allow for the U.S. to have a cheap supply of coffee.
So, like, the happy farmer that I see on my Starbucks wall is potentially in Nicaragua.
Well, I mean, okay, so what's it? No, No, there's an interesting story about that, actually, is that we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here.
We'll go back and forth.
Okay. That essentially the first kind of iteration of free trade coffee, like you're describing with the happy farmer at Starbucks, kind of evolves out of the sort of pro-Nicaragua movement in the United States, right? Companies like Equal Exchange Coffee in Boston and Thanksgiving Coffee based out of Fort Bragg, California, start to, sell Nicaraguan coffee beans at a time in which the coffee industry under the Sandinistas becomes nationalized, and in some cases, right, the landholders are kicked off of the land and these agricultural cooperatives are established amongst the peasants, and so these kind of independent coffee sellers will push selling Nicaraguan coffee as a way for sort of progressives in the United States to support the Nicaraguan Revolution.
Wow.
And that's kind of how free trade coffee emerges in the United States.
Well,
kind of cool.
I had no idea. Very cool.
Yeah.
So let's get there then. So how do we get to that these cooperatives have to go in a roundabout way to support free trade coffee? How do we get to the nationalization? How do we get to the fall of the Somoza?
Oh, yeah, totally. So essentially, right, kind of like Cuba, right? Nicaragua is able to overthrow Somoza, not because everybody is totally like gung-ho on Somoza, right? But much like in Cuba where everybody just hated Batista, right? Everybody totally hates Somoza as of the early 70s. So like in Managua, the capital of Nicaragua, in 1972, there's a massive earthquake that essentially destroys the entire city. Yeah. And so like during that period, there had been kind of rising rates of middle class membership in Nicaragua, right? Rising levels of prosperity, employment, etc., right? Much of that is destroyed by this huge earthquake. And what happens is, right, aid comes in from abroad, from the United States, from other countries, right, to help rebuild Managua.
Yeah.
Somoza does not distribute this aid, right? Okay. And sort of keeps it to himself and squanders it. And this sort of builds this building anti-Somoza sentiment in Nicaragua, right?
Wow.
And the Sandinistas, by the kind of 1977, right, emerge as the most sort of viable iteration of anti-Somoza politics, right?
Yeah.
And so sort of the, I guess, like, the people that own the businesses in Nicaragua, not the socialists, right, but the people who have a little bit of property, right, the bourgeoisie, for lack of a better term, right, side with the Sandinistas because they're the kind of the only vehicle that exists at that time that is powerful enough to sort of overthrow Somoza.
Wow. So I think it's important to highlight here too the economic impact, because we talk, it seems like, okay, we're always talking about conflict a lot of times on Our History, regime change, revolution, these things like capture our attention as historians. And I don't know how many different people I've talked to, it always starts with like a natural disaster and someone being greedy. And like we still read about it with like Haiti and Syria and just even the terrible things like Oxfam was doing, like, oh my God, all this like squandered aid, and it starts. But I'm curious. So you say like the Sandinistas are like a viable option. Like, like I think when most people hear Sandinista, they think like radical or extreme, right? For whatever reason. What's the case? What's the actuality? What are these Sandinistas like on the ground? And if I'm like a wealthy plantation owner, how do I see the Sandinistas?
That's a good question. So I guess at its like, just to start out, right, what are the Sandinistas' politics, right? So the Sandinistas, right, Sandinista, it means like follower of Sandino, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. Like Zapatistas are the follower of Zapata, right? So Sandino is this, he's like an anarcho-syndicalist. Wow. In the, like, he's a peasant, right? And he leads a guerrilla insurrection against the U.S. Marines who occupied Nicaragua during the 1920s, roughly from 1920 to 1932, right? And Sandino leads an insurrection against the Marines stationed in Nicaragua, right? He's eventually, once Somoza gets to power, right, it's actually the U.S. occupation that establishes Somoza. Eventually, Somoza kills Sandino, right? But Sandino lives on in sort of the memory of.
He becomes a martyr.
And sort of he's this anti-Yankee sort of hero of Nicaragua. So, right, I guess the sort of Nicaraguan Sandinistas, right there, they're anti-imperialist, right? Much like Sandino was. Mm-hmm. They are socialist, right? And also, there's kind of an interesting sort of crossover between the Sandinistas and sort of a sort of left-wing Christianity, right? Liberation theology that kind of uses the Bible as a pamphlet of revolution, essentially.
So were the Sandinistas? They're not anti-religion.
No, not like the Soviets. Yeah, I mean, so
or even the Cubans.
Oh yeah. So, right, that's the cool thing about Central America during this time is that Christianity is really sort of intertwined with socialist politics.
Very interesting. And so the presumably the people that own the plantations, is it a mix between Americans and just wealthy Nicaraguans, or like who's in charge of Nicaragua right now? Okay,
so Somoza is the biggest landowner in Nicaragua during this time. Yeah. So essentially, right, most of the coffee plantations in Nicaragua at this time are owned by Somoza.
Oh, wow. Okay, so so he's obviously anti-Sandinista, as one might imagine. Yeah. And so how do you go about overthrowing a dictator?
Okay, good question, right?
Russians, if you're listening. No, I'm just kidding.
No, right, seriously. So essentially, right, what happens is there's a growing insurrection in the countryside, right? The people who are most kind of interested in Sandinista politics, like much like in most revolutions, right, are the people that are most oppressed, the people that have the least amount of power, right? So those are the peasants in the countryside, right? They side with the Sandinistas first. And starting in 1977, I believe, right, the National Guard, Somoza's henchmen, essentially, will go into the countryside and massacre thousands of peasants who they believe to be Sandinista supporters, right? In that same, I believe it's 1977. It might be 78.
Right.
I'm not positive, but Sandinistas take control, take hostage, right, the agricultural minister in the countryside at this time, and they publicize their sort of fight, right, their sort of quest for revolution as one of their demands to get this guy released, right? So their kind of prominence grows during this period, right? And sort of that we see in Nicaragua during the sort of lead up to the overthrow of Somoza in 1979, the Sandinistas taking more and more cities, right? Eventually.
So this is an interesting tactic. I have to cut you off.
No, you're good.
It's like when we're thinking of revolution, or
Yeah.
like, you don't think, well, let's capture the agricultural minister. You know, like, it's not. I mean, no one could name the agricultural minister of the U.S.
Right.
Maybe no, I don't want to go. I think I know who it is. But
Okay.
I'm not even gonna try because I'll be wrong.
Yeah, sure.
But
Yeah,
that's a strange thing to do, right?
Yeah.
How does that and I see this with like Mexican cartels do a lot of, you know, kidnappings. Is that like the revolutionary tactic, or was this just a one-off to gain notoriety?
Well, I think like I think it's like connected to this, you know, the fact that Nicaragua during this time, right, much like all of Central America, right, is predominantly an export economy, right? It's an economy based on growing things on the land, right, and selling it at market to places like the United States, right? So who owns the land, right, in Nicaragua is the person that has the power, right?
Nice. Yeah.
So that's why we see like land reform being such a like huge issue in all these revolutions happening in Latin America during this time.
'Cause that's where the money is.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the Sandinistas find they have this. This is a struggle that had been going on for a long time. You know, this sort of genealogy of struggle going back to Somoza had been in power for generations. The family in power. The Sandinistas had been fighting. There's clear problems. Even though Nicaragua, you know, agriculturally very wealthy, the nation is still poor. I would imagine most peasants are illiterate. I would imagine most, you know, have few rights, have very little opportunity for advancement. So the Sandinistas continue to build this popular support, as you sort of see in other revolutions, and they continue to fight for power. I have it right so far, yes?
You got it.
Yeah, so then what? So
then essentially, right, I think, you know, in 1979, July 19th, 1979, the Sandinistas officially take over the National Palace in Managua, the capital, overthrow Somoza. Somoza flees to Miami, right? And the Sandinistas establish a junta, essentially.
Okay.
The interesting thing about the Sandinistas, right, is it's never like Cuba or the Soviet Union where sort of the state owns everything, right? There's always, during this revolution, right, a mix of private and public, right? The state never owns everything. There still are private enterprises in Nicaragua, right? As we move forward in the revolution, sort of their private enterprises' ability to do whatever they want is kind of halted, right? Because eventually, right, the United States wages a covert war against Nicaragua. But it's never a totally communist country, right?
Okay.
Sort of more like a place like Norway or something.
So a lot is nationalized, but not everything. And what is decided? Are the most profitable places nationalized? Like what is the process of decision, or is that like too deep? We don't need to go that deep.
So essentially, right, like there are private business owners in Nicaragua, right?
And now, are these people who are like allied with the Sandinistas? Is there a total switch? Because very few people survive the Cuban Revolution,
right?
And you know, some do,
right?
I think Raul Castro marries an heiress to the Bacardi fortune. Actually,
okay, interesting.
Yeah, but like very few do. Very few do. So is this like? Is it almost a total change, even though there's still private ownership? Is it a total change in power? Because that's typically what happens in a revolution, right?
Okay, so it's like a gradual process, I would say. Okay. When the revolution begins, because of the fact that the Sandinistas needed the support of the property owners, right, of the bourgeoisie, in order to overthrow Somoza, right, there is, while sort of there are programs being developed, right? And we can talk about that sort of are designed to benefit the working class, right? The Sandinistas do not impede in sort of people that own private enterprises' ability to make money. I think this changes, right, because of the Contra War, which we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, we're not quite there.
Okay.
Well, because I'm curious, so what is the initial sort of U.S. reaction, maybe politically and on the ground?
Okay.
So let's start crossing those international,
All right,
which I know you love to do.
Yeah. I'm all over the place. But
yeah, good.
So like, it's interesting, right? So when the Sandinistas overthrow Somoza, right, in 1979, Carter's the president, right? Carter is, the famous Iran hostage crisis, right? He's seen as being weak, right? In Nicaragua, right? He also similarly, not that I think he's weak. I'm pro Carter, sure, for kind of, but he is in this story. I am. He is kind of hands off. He eventually, as he sees the Somoza dictatorship, right, massacring peasants in the countryside, right, he pulls aid out of Nicaragua, pulls his support from Somoza, right? And initially, when the Sandinista government comes to power, because there is sort of this diversity in sort of political views, as I talked about in this kind of junta that starts, he is supportive of the Sandinistas.
Okay.
Right? But this changes, right, when the next president comes into the sort of...
Right, so the Sandinistas are just setting out their political platform, and, well, because the way I'm understanding it is a coalition that's spreading a wide range of ideologies.
Yeah.
And then, so they're trying to figure out what to do with this new country, what direction that they're going to go.
Yeah.
And in the meanwhile, the U.S. is undergoing a pretty significant regime change. Iran just had its revolution, so there's the change in that formerly U.S.-backed regime is gone. In Cuba, Castro tries to establish relations with Carter. They work together, right? And then the Muriel boat lift happens in 1980. Mm-hmm. So this is a time in Central America and the United States where we're seeing pretty significant changes. So it's kind of hard to get a stable regime, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So what happens when Carter leaves office?
Well,
or where does the U.S. go towards the Sandinistas?
Oh, they change 180 degrees, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Reagan is elected to office after Carter is loses the election, elected to office in 1981, right? Is that the right year?
Or that's when he takes it.
Yeah. So, right, Reagan is essentially kind of revamps the Cold War, right? There's a sort of sense of defeat after the United States loses the war in Vietnam in 1975, and kind of Reagan will, while other presidents, right, had been sort of apprehensive to really sort of engage in a military conflict in another country, right? Reagan will kind of revamp the sort of militarism of an earlier era and kind of paint Nicaragua as a threat to the United States, right? And in 1981, he will start pumping millions of dollars covertly through the CIA into a group of former Somoza National Guardsmen,
right,
called the Contras, and that kind of starts the Contra War. That is kind of a quest to overthrow the Sandinista government. And
this is straight out of the U.S. political playbook, right? Find a group of guys who hates the guy that you hate, give them money, training, and weapons,
right, and
then let them fight a war, and you don't have to fight it, right?
Yeah.
So that's the plan.
That's the plan.
And what is the Sandinista reaction? What is the American reaction? Where do we go from there?
Yeah, totally. Well, obviously the Sandinista reaction is they're not happy about it, right? It's a threat to their, self-determination, ability to kind of achieve the progress that they want to achieve, right? In the early 80s, right, they established this massive literacy campaign, much like they had in Cuba, right, in which they, cut the illiteracy rate nearly in half in a period of 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, let's focus on that for a second. So one of the first things they do to get in power is teach the peasantry to read.
Right.
And how do they do that? what are their tactics on that?
Well, so it's interesting, right? So it's kind of a national sort of plan to like unite the sort of urbanite class, right, with the peasantry, right, and kind of create a more nationalized sense of identity, in the sense that they get kind of college students, high school students from the cities to go out to the countryside, right, and teach peasants how to read, right. Oftentimes they're sort of reading Pro Sandanista sort of pamphlets and things like that, sort of familiarizing the peasantry with the Sandinistas' politics and teaching them to read at the same time.
I see.
The interesting thing is that, sorry to interrupt.
No, keep going.
That Americans are involved in this too, right? People from the United States will come down and also participate in this massive literacy campaign to teach the peasantry how to read.
What about the church?
The church. So there's kind of a split, right, between the mainstream Catholic Church, right, that is sort of apprehensive to support liberation theology, right, and then the popular church that kind of exists in the barrios of the cities in Nicaragua at this time, right?
Very interesting.
Yeah,
that literacy campaign sounds very similar to Cuba.
Yeah, it's totally similar.
And I imagine it's equally successful. I'm always shocked, like, whenever I'm hearing about these dictators and like these regimes that were like, you see I'm sure there was development in Nicaragua like Cuba, but like it seems so easy to make the peasants literate, but they just don't want to. Right. Like, it's so easy to send college students and do things like that. I think that's a very interesting thing, and that's very interesting how that shows you how bad things were. If that's the first thing you want to do is teach people how to read. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's kind of extraordinary. Okay, so they do that. What else?
What else happens?
And this, meanwhile, are the Contras forming, or this still?
The Contras are forming, right? So some other things that the Sandinistas do, right? They they establish these mass organizations, kind of like the Soviets in the kind of Soviet Union era of the Russian Revolution, right? Yeah. In which there's kind of these councils of various groups, like peasants, agricultural workers, artists. Sometimes there's kind of a female mass organization, right? And these mass organizations, right, they vote together, they elect one person to serve in the National Assembly as a means of sort of getting their voice heard by the government, etc. Okay. So that's kind of one thing that they do. There's massive art campaigns, right, in which sort of pro-Sandinista murals are painted throughout the country.
Yeah, I would imagine that. And so, what if I'm someone who's like, I don't like these Sandinistas because they take my farm or whatever. Right. What happens to me?
I think you would probably move to Miami.
Okay, so
or
there was
move
a time
to San Francisco.
So there's a mass exodus.
There is an exodus.
And does the U.S. take them willingly?
The U.S. does take them, right? Much like the kind of Mariel boat lift during this time, right? Immigration policies of the Reagan administration as they relate to Central America is interesting, right? Because we are like open to taking Nicaraguans, right? Because we oppose the Nicaraguan government at this time. But with somewhere like El Salvador, right? And compared to Guatemala, compared to El Salvador, Nicaragua is pretty peaceful at this time, right? It's not in a good place as with the sort of Contra War moves forward, but compared to a place like El Salvador and Guatemala, where there's like an all-out war in the cities between the government and the Marxist guerrillas, right? Those people are not able to come to the United States in the same numbers that the Sandinista refugees, if you want to call them that, right, are able to, because we're supportive of the governments in power in El Salvador and Guatemala.
So does the like expat community, do they become like sort of the Miami Cuban community where they're like, they want to go back and fight, or like, are there people supporting the Sandinistas from the U.S.?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, no, definitely there's a group of people in the United States that, fled the Sandinista government, right? And to this day, right, there's a like a number of coffee shops in San Francisco owned by a Nicaraguan, opposition leader of the Sandinistas, right?
Oh, really? Yeah, you're from the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Okay. Full disclosure. Keith is also a Californian.
Yeah.
And so, I had no idea. So there's these Nicaraguan coffee shops that are owned by a former Somoza ally.
Right, or someone who, at least, maybe not Somoza ally, but somebody who didn't like the Sandinistas, right?
Very interesting.
And so there is like a class, right, of people who, as the Sandinistas, right, kind of get shift more and more towards socialism, right, leave the United States for Miami and San Francisco primarily. They're never like as powerful as sort of the Cuban Miami group, right? But they're there. And as far as kind of my research goes, right, there's a huge group of Americans that are also, right, like very supportive of the Sandinistas.
And Americans.
Mm-hmm. And also, right, people from Mexico, Venezuela, all throughout Latin America and Europe too.
Okay, so tell me more about this group. There's the American Pro Sandinistas.
Yeah. So they're interesting, right?
Or I guess I just call them Sandinistas because in it they are pro.
Yeah, sure. So they're this group of sort of, progressive activists in the United States that are sort of coming out of the new left in the 60s, right, that wants to create some sort of alternative to the sort of, very sort of hierarchically structured, right, Stalinist sort of politics of the Soviet Union, right? They want sort of a more sort of horizontal approach to leftism than sort of somewhere like Cuba or somewhere like the Soviet Union could offer. And Nicaragua to them looks like maybe that place, right?
So like a
more horizontal,
a place of potential.
Yeah.
And so how do they link up, or do they link up, or is this just like what is the connection?
They do link up. The connection starts right in San Francisco, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because San Francisco in the 1970s has the biggest Nicaraguan population outside of Nicaragua, and in the late 1970s, a group called El Comité Cívico Pro Liberación de Nicaragua forms in San Francisco's Mission District, which is kind of like the, center of the Latino community in San Francisco. And this kind of organization, right, has a newspaper. They're in touch with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and they're important, right, because they are able to, while the fighting is happening, right, they're able to get information out to the Nicaraguan community in San Francisco, right? Whereas the press under Somoza during the fighting, right, is really restricted, right? They're not reporting on the casualties in the countryside, right, killed by the National Guardsmen. So they perform an important task of sort of getting the message out to the Nicaraguan expat community, right? And eventually, people in this organization, as sort of it seems more and more likely that Somoza is going to lose, actually go to Nicaragua and join the Sandinistas and help them overthrow the Somoza government, much like, right, the Lincoln Brigades or something in the Spanish Civil War.
Ah, very interesting. So this is like sort of an international war effort.
Yeah.
And you see internationalism a lot on the left, like that sort of idea of, class warfare more so than nationalism. But there is a certain element of nationalism to this as well.
Oh, yeah.
So who are the non-Nicaraguans supporting? Who are the Americans supporting Sandino, or is that like not as big of a group? Like
the U.S. people that are interested in
right?
Sandinistas?
Yeah, are there because Abraham Lincoln Brigade? I'm thinking of like Jews and African Americans go and fight in the Spanish.
Yeah. Oh, like what are the demographics?
Right.
Well. So it starts off, right, as mostly kind of a cause of the sort of Latino left, right? People involved in sort of the Azatlan movement in places like LA and San Francisco, right? Coming out of the Chicano movement, people of Mexican descent and Nicaraguan descent, etc. But as sort of the revolution happens, right, as sort of it seems like Nicaragua is going to need more and more help, after the revolution, they need to kind of rebuild infrastructure, etc., right? This organization starts kind of recruiting more broadly, right? Opening sort of their ranks up to kind of white, middle class, progressives and leftists, right? And so, after that, sort of the ranks of sort of who is supporting the Sandinistas in the United States grows dramatically, right? During this period, right, groups like the Black Panthers, who are in Oakland at this time, right, who, are declining in influence in the 1970s, but still are a pretty prominent Oakland organization, right, are, publishing articles in their paper about the Sandinistas at this time, publishing messages of support and solidarity, right? Groups like the Socialist Workers' Party, right? Important sort of Trotskyist organization. They also are like supporting the Sandinistas in their papers and in their sort of demonstrations, etc., right? And increasingly, right, on the left, Nicaragua is seen as another chance, right, to kind of make socialism work.
Right, and so does it work? Do they arrive at communism? They realized communism? I've heard Nicaragua is a nice place, but
yeah,
what happens?
Well, what happens is that, it's tough, right? I think the one kind of takeaway I take from this story, right, is that it's difficult for, I guess Cuba has proved us wrong, but like it's difficult for socialism to exist in sort of a larger global sort of framework in which there's neighboring countries that have way more sort of economic power, way more sort of political power, that want nothing more than to see that society fail.
Right. So is it the neighbors? Who is it that ultimately like sort of brings the Sandinistas down?
Yeah, absolutely, it's the United States, right?
Yeah.
So during the Contra War, right? These agricultural cooperatives are attacked. These schoolhouses that are teaching people literacy are burned to the ground, right? The peasantry is being massacred, right? Inflation is rising. There's an economic embargo in 1985 imposed on by the United States, right? So food is more and more scarce, right?
Yeah.
And so the situation in Nicaragua gets more and more dire, right?
Yeah.
Because of the war, because of the economic embargo. And the way actually that the Sandinistas get voted out of power, the revolution officially ends in 1990.
They get voted out of power.
They get voted out of power. So the Contras do not overthrow them.
Right. So it's an unsuccessful U.S. It's a huge scandal, and it doesn't work.
But it kind of does.
Okay,
right?
How does it work?
Because, so the party that wins in 1990 is the UNO party, right? Who the president her name is Violeta Chamorro. And she is, supported by the CIA, obviously. And she runs, on a platform that she can end the war, right? Because, right, the war is happening because the United States hates the Sandinistas, right? So people vote for her, right? And it's not because they are, hated the kind of advancements that the Sandinistas make. It's because they hated the war, right?
Yeah.
And they see sort of this party and their kind of pro-U.S. politics as a way of ending the war. And when they vote for her in mass, and eventually, right, the war ends.
So the war ends shortly after she comes to power, and then what? Where's Nicaragua?
Where's Nicaragua?
I heard China was trying to build another Panama Canal.
Right.
So Nicaragua now democratic country with a reasonable amount of freedom.
Well,
you were just there.
I was
right?
just
Tell
there.
us about that.
Oh, it was great. It's a beautiful place. Everyone's really nice. It's, the Sandinistas are back in power now.
Uh-huh.
Ortega has been the president since 2006, I think.
And we're no longer sending Contras to...
We're no longer sending the Contras over. So I think it's like important to emphasize, right, that I don't know if Nicaragua is totally democratic these days, right? Like the Sandinistas now are kind of a very different iteration of politics than it was in the 70s and the 80s, right? So after 1990, right, after the UNO party comes to power, right, there's something called the piñata that happens, in which sort of these nationalized coffee plantations, right, because sort of the Sandinistas are worried that after they lose the election that these nationalized properties are going to be sold into private hands, right? The Sandinistas buy them up, right? And they become owned by the Sandinistas, right? Those properties have never been nationalized again, and they've actually enabled people like Daniel Ortega, who was elected president by the Sandinista party in '84 and is now the president again, to amass a personal fortune.
So it sounds like he's become Somoza.
Yeah, that's like the Minister of Culture, right? Ernesto Cardenal, in a lot of his talks, right? Yeah, he actually compares Ortega to Somoza, right? And when I was in Nicaragua this past summer, they just had an election much like we did around the same time, and Ortega won, right? And so, most of them were like, we don't have democracy here. Like, our sort of elections are rigged.
And so what's it sort of like when you're there? Is there still, like, these Sandinista murals are still there?
Yeah.
Are there still like, I know when I traveled in Bosnia, you see the graves from the recent wars, and you see the, like, and it just takes a profound impact. Like, are there those kind of visible scars?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I was in the city of León primarily, right, which was the first city that the Sandinistas took over in the revolution. It's still kind of a very sort of bastion of pro-Sandinista left-wing politics. And yeah, there's, murals of martyrs. There's these halls of all the pictures of fighters from León that were killed in the Contra War, etc., right? So yeah, I mean, the Contra War is definitely firmly implanted in the minds of the people there.
And you said everyone was nice. There's no animosity towards Americans, or what?
Well, I think, right, like, one kind of key aspect of the revolution, right, was sort of much like, in Cuba, right?
Yeah.
That sort of there's a separation between the government and sort of the kind of people that are on the left in the United States, right? The Nicaraguan government wanted Americans to come down and support their cause, right? They wanted the support of American citizens, right? And so in order to cultivate that, right, there's an anti-U.S. government sentiment,
right,
but not sort of American people sentiment. And I think that sort of sentiment is still kind of there today.
So I'd imagine if the Sandinistas are in power again, or at least some iteration there's been no like Truth and Reconciliation type commission that like South Africa did. Or have there been war crimes trials or anything like that? Because that's a significant period of war that's happening, or violence and murders, and like if your son was murdered by someone, right, and these vendettas last, and that's how these civil wars last for a long time. Does that still exist, or has there been closure to these wars?
Oh man,
there's no real commission, or there's no sort of like
I mean, to my knowledge, there has been no Truth or Reconciliation Committee. They had one in Guatemala, I know. I don't know the answer to that.
That's a good...
that's an interesting question that I'd love to look more into.
Well, because I wonder about these things, and you think about these, like, sort of, you visit these places that just had war 5 or 10 years ago, and you just think, like, what side were you on? Like, how'd you get out? It's just sort of an interesting concept. Another question I have.
Sure.
How does a guy from Bay Area, California, get... you said these coffee shops.
Yeah.
How did you get involved? Like, why Nicaragua?
So, like, I guess there's, like, two answers to that question. Like, so, like, growing up in the Bay Area, right, there was always kind of this running joke that, like, especially, like, when I went to San Francisco State, like, you'd make fun of some of the professors, right? They'd be like, oh, yeah, he's one of those guys that, like, overpronounces Nicaragua. Like,
Nicaragua.
Yeah. So it's kind of like this like funny way of making fun of like
might just be a
white
California
progressives
thing.
Or something. Yeah. But I was thinking, why are, like, because, like, you know, you'd have this professor and they'd be like, oh, I spent like 3 months in the 80s, like in Nicaragua or something. And, you know, I was like, why are there all these white people like overpronouncing Nicaragua in the Bay Area? And so it kind of started as that. And then I learned more about the, you know, poets in the Mission District that I talked about that go down to support the Sandinistas, and it kind of went from there. And I realized that sort of as I talked to more and more people, right, about my project, I would, you know, I worked at a coffee shop in West Philly for a while, and one of my coworkers, right, when I talked to her and told her about this project, she was like, oh yeah, my mom did that.
Whoa.
And so like I interviewed her mom, and I just realized that sort of these people that were mispronouncing or overpronouncing Nicaragua, right, the reason they would do that because they were involved in this kind of extensive struggle in the United States to support the Sandinista government.
This direct connection.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the last, I swear I'll let you go.
No, I'm having a great time.
But the Sandinista flag, can you
Sure.
just tell me, like, because so I know, as soon as I see it, it's, and I'll put a picture on the website, there's a red band and a black band.
Right.
And that, to me, that immediately evokes Haitian Revolution, because the Toussaint Louverture uses a similar red and black. Also the Cuban Revolution, Castro uses a red and black flag for his initial movement. Is it connected to those, or is it just unique? Is that like a socialist anarchist thing? What's going on?
So my understanding of it is like the red and black flag, right? Yeah, it kind of is a supposed to like represent anarcho-syndicalism. Right?
Okay, so it's like Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, communal ownership of the factories, right? Etc. No leaderless kind of ownership of the factories.
Got it.
And so Sandino, right, kind of influenced by the sort of presence of that philosophy during the Mexican Revolution, right, also was an anarcho-syndicalist. And his flag, right, is that sort of red and black flag with a kind of skull and crossbones in the middle of it. And so the Sandinistas' current like flag, right, you know, is linked back to that sort of early iteration of Sandino's anarcho-syndicalist politics.
But that never becomes the national flag of Nicaragua?
No, it's just the flag of the party.
And Nicaragua has that blue, white, blue, the Central American colors, right? Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Cool. Yeah. Well, any more thoughts? Anything that everyone should know on Sandinistas? Parting words of wisdom?
I don't know. You know, I don't know. I think it's just an interesting kind of movement that kind of doesn't get enough play that I think influences our modern day sort of progressive politics, right? Bernie Sanders was down there in the 80s. Bill de Blasio gets his first iteration into politics, you know, helping to rebuild schools destroyed by the Contras, like, you know, so there are big names that are involved in this struggle, I guess. So that's an interesting tidbit.
No, that's absolutely interesting. Yeah. And if nothing else, that's a reason that we should know about it. If these people who are elected into office and have very powerful movements were involved in it, it's certainly something we should know. Wow. What a pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Steve. So much fun. And I love the podcast.
Absolutely. Thank
cool.
you. Thanks for joining us, Keith. This week we were talking about the Sandinistas. Continue, please, to support us by subscribing on iTunes, Google Play, or YouTube. And thanks for joining Hour of History. Remember, it's our world, anytime, any place.
Right.
Thanks, Keith.